Lesson 7, Chapter 8, Late Victorian and Edwardian Britain, Social and Political Change. This chapter examines political and social developments in the last decades of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century. Ireland in the later Victorian and Edwardian periods played an outsized role in British politics. Nationalist demands for greater autonomy and even Irish independence fueled political and social movements in Ireland, and what was called the land question morphed into the broader national question. Calls for land reform in Ireland were long-standing, and based on the fact that a small number of landowners owned all the agricultural land in Ireland, and most of the farmers, those who actually farmed the land, did not own their own land, but rather rented it. In addition to this, there was a perception that most landowners were Protestant, and thus there was a link to the history of English colonialism in Ireland over the centuries. It was true that the largest landowners were Protestant, but it was not true that most landowners were Protestant. What mattered more, however, was that it was the perception at the time that landowners were Protestant, that they had little in common with their Catholic tenants, and that they supported the union with Britain and British interests. Thus, in the later Victorian period, calls for a more equitable distribution of land, or at least a revision of the land law to reduce the great power of landowners, became part of the larger nationalist movement. That is, the settlement of the land question would be a stepping stone to solving the national question. The Irish Land War of the late 1870s and early 1880s was a widespread movement to challenge the socio-economic and political power of the landowning class in Ireland. Led by the Land League, the power and authority of landowners was subverted through campaigns aiming to unite the farmers against the landowners, to hold back the payment of rents, and to force a change in the land law. As discussed in the text, it is clear why a leader such as Michael Davitt would be attracted to the cause. The leadership of Charles Stewart Parnell, however, is more interesting in some ways, and is an important reminder in studying Irish history to not fall into the trap in assuming that all Protestants were Unionists who opposed nationalist aspirations of returning the Dublin Parliament or even securing independence. The land war was significant in forcing Gladstone's government into granting land law reform. Gladstone, the grand old man, had over time become convinced of the need for major reforms to placate the Irish. Indeed, he talked of the need for justice for Ireland, where previous prime ministers had talked rather of an Irish policy of, quote, kicks and kindness, that is, ameliorative legislation combined with strong security measures and the suspension of civil liberties. Gladstone had become converted to Irish Home Rule by the mid-1880s. Home Rule meant various things to various people, but the most common definition was a return of the Parliament back to Dublin, but a maintenance of the union between Ireland and Britain. There was, however, strong opposition to Home Rule, both within Gladstone's own party and more widely in Britain and Ireland itself. The main opposition in Ireland came from the Protestant population in the north of the country, mainly in the province of Ulster. To many Protestants, Home Rule would mean Rome Rule. That is, they feared an Irish Parliament, which, since Catholic emancipation, would now be dominated by Catholics, since Catholics were the majority population in Ireland. Indeed, the history of Ireland from the 1880s until the 1920s is largely centered on the independence movement on the one hand, and the strong and passionate Ulster opposition on the other. As Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father, famously declared, "Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right." Gladstone's first Home Rule Bill was defeated in the Commons, where over 100 of his own MPs voted against it. This resulted in a split in the Liberal Party, as the so-called Liberal Unionists drifted away from the main Liberal Party and eventually merged with the Conservative Party in 1912. A second Home Rule Bill was introduced with Gladstone's Liberals returned to power in 1892, and this too was unsuccessful. A third and final Home Rule Bill was eventually passed on the eve of World War I, but was suspended for the duration of the war, and in fact was never fully implemented as events unfolded. Clearly then, the Irish developments greatly affected British politics. The Home Rule Bill split the Liberal Party and allowed the Conservatives to dominate politics for the next 2 decades. As the text explains, however, the Third Reform Act, in addition to the Illegal Practices Act and the Redistribution Act, all proved challenging to the Conservatives and helped to diminish the political influence of traditional elites by increasing the electorate, limiting the amount of campaign spending, and giving urban areas more parliamentary representation. The Conservative leader, the Marquess of Salisbury, who succeeded Disraeli upon his death in 1881, is often seen as a reactionary, out-of-touch, aristocratic prime minister. Indeed, he was the last prime minister to lead from the House of Lords rather than the House of Commons. The text refers to Salisbury as a skeptical imperialist, which points to some of the ambivalence of his views on empire. He saw the political benefit to the Conservative Party of empire, though he disliked the jingoism or inflated nationalist view of the empire itself, the crude popular political support that it drew. His view of the empire was how it benefited Britain, not that the empire was a good goal in itself. As the text notes, Salisbury was a skeptical imperialist, yet he was prime minister during a period of tremendous imperial expansion in the 1880s and 1890s. Part of the reason to explain this is to point to the pragmatic politician in Salisbury, who recognized the importance of imperial expansion in international relations. One of the important social changes in Britain at the time was the emergence of a working-class mass culture. As discussed in the text, legislative changes governing the workplace created a real distinction between work and leisure. Soccer, music hall entertainment, trips to the seaside, and so on, marked clear leisure activities for the working class. There was still great poverty for the working class, however, particularly in large cities. While urban poverty and poor living conditions for the working class was not new at the time, what were the dire changes facing the land-owning and aristocratic class. The value of the agricultural sector declined as cheaper grains and meats could be imported from further abroad. Declining prices for British agriculture led to declining rents paid by British farmers to their landowners, and a decline in the value of land. And in addition to this, the wealthy were being taxed for the first real time with income taxes and land taxes. This led, by the first 2 decades of the 20th century, to a massive selling off of landed estates and their goods, the largest transfer of land in Britain since the 16th century. One of the really unfortunate outcomes of this great socio-economic change was that there was not enough well-heeled buyers to take on the money pit estates and large houses, which led to a large number of them being destroyed or left to decay. The decline of the landed estates had ripple effects in the labor market too, as fewer and fewer servants and domestic servants were needed and therefore employed. Local big houses had always been great centers for local young men and women to get lifelong employment. Now they would have to look elsewhere. Opportunities for middle class and those at the higher end of the working class women improved in the later 19th century, with new possibilities for employment in offices. Work as clerks and secretaries greatly increased, and so too did the number of retail shops and department stores. The text examines other aspects of the place of women in the period, and also discusses contemporary attitudes to homosexuality in late Victorian Britain. The most famous case illustrating the criminality of homosexuality was that of the Irish literary giant Oscar Wilde. The Marquess of Queensberry left a calling card at Wilde's club with the statement, quote, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite," unquote. This was tantamount to calling Wilde a homosexual, which of course was a crime at the time. The issue for Queensberry was that Wilde was in a relationship with his son, Lord Alfred Douglas. Wilde took Queensberry to court on a charge of libel, that is, that Queensberry had slandered Wilde with untrue statements. Queensberry was acquitted, and Wilde's testimony during the trial left him open to a future prosecution on sodomy or gross indecency grounds. Wilde was duly convicted of gross indecency, jailed for 2 years, and later fled to Paris a broken man, where he died a few years later. In politics, the Conservatives dominated government until the landslide Liberal victory in the 1906 election. Another significant development in British politics was the emergence of a new party, the Labour Party. Established in the 1890s, the new party drew substantial support from the working-class voters. In the 1906 election, the Liberal and Labour parties agreed to form a progressive alliance, where the Liberal Party did not run candidates against 40 Labour constituencies. This helped many more Labour candidates get elected to Parliament. The next few years were significant in social legislation, with the Old Age Pensions Act of 1908, which granted a small pension for those over the age of 70, limits on the length of the workday, and banning the imprisonment of children under 14. One of the great political showdowns occurred in 1909 over the budget to pay for these new reforms. David Lloyd George's Liberals sought new taxes, largely placed on the wealthy and landowners, to pay for the reforms. The budget passed the Commons, but was defeated in the Lords, prompting a new election fought largely on the budget. The Liberals were returned with a greatly reduced majority, but they passed the budget again, and this time the Lords were forced to pass it, recognizing that they had overstepped their bounds. Pressing the matter further, the Liberals made a great legislative alteration in powers by introducing the Parliament Bill, which would prevent the House of Lords from blocking budget bills in the future, and setting a 2-year limit on the Lords' veto power. That is, the Lords could only hold up legislation for 2 years, but could not veto it. In order to pass the legislation, the new king, George V, who succeeded Edward VII, who had died in May of 1910, promised to create enough new Liberal peers to flood the House of Lords, and who would thus ensure the legislation passed. After another general election fought on this parliamentary reform, with another Liberal government returned, the Lords finally passed the legislation, greatly reducing their own powers. The parliamentary settlement stabilized these contentious issues in the government for now, but there were areas of unrest that have led some historians and observers to talk of the Edwardian crisis, centering on the call for women to get the vote, widespread labour strikes, and civil unrest in Ireland. The text examines all three of these issues. For this lesson, I will just spend a little time on the Irish case. Civil unrest in Ireland centered on the question of Home Rule, and whether, if it passed, would it be applied to the whole country, or would there be an exception for the majority Protestant counties of Ulster, who opposed it. Significantly, the abolition of the House of Lords' veto power over legislation had removed the main obstacle to Home Rule, and the opposition shifted thus to the Unionists of Ulster. The Home Rule Bill was introduced in April 1912, and was like its two predecessors from the 1880s and 1890s, intending to give limited self-government to Ireland. Dublin would get its own parliament with jurisdiction over internal matters, and the Westminster Parliament would cover larger issues of policy, such as war and peace, defence, and so on. The Irish would vote for MPs to the Dublin Parliament, and would also send 42 MPs to the Westminster Parliament. Opposition to the Home Rule Bill was well organized in Ulster. In September 1912, 500,000 people signed the Ulster Covenant, in which signatories pledged to use, quote, all means which may be found necessary to defeat the present conspiracy to set up a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland, unquote. Just what all means necessary became clear the following year when Unionists began buying up guns, forming units of men, drilling and practicing military maneuvers. The Ulster Volunteer Force was formed in January 1913 and was led by retired senior officers from the British Army. In response to the arming and drilling of this Protestant paramilitary force in Ulster that was pledged to resist the implementation of Home Rule by force, a nationalist militia or paramilitary force was formed in the south of Ireland in Dublin in response. This nationalist militia, called the Irish Volunteer Force, would oppose the Unionist one and would insist on the implementation of Home Rule should it be passed in Parliament. Thus, by late 1913 there was a near civil war in Ireland, as there were two groups of armed men with political objectives and strong resolve to press their case through force of arms if needed. Home Rule legislation was passed and was set to take effect in September 1914. However, the outbreak of World War I intervened, and Home Rule was suspended for the duration of the war. Admittedly, of course, people thought that the war would be over in less than 6 months.